I can hear you. That's always good.
Not in New York at Katz's Deli, but my friend runs Katz's Deli, so I always put this up.
It's a great advertisement and looks really cool anyway.
I look like a pile of pastrami here.
But it's very fitting for your part of the world anyway.
Yeah, it is. Where are you located?
I'm in Yorkshire. The nearest town to me is Leeds,
Oh, okay.
as in obviously the album Live at Leeds.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. The thing I'm really excited. I'm actually coming to the UK in January with Lyle Lovett, and we're playing Glasgow, Dublin, Belfast, and then two shows in London. But I haven't been over there since Phil Collins. So it's going to be nice to have a little bit of time, a week and a half or whatever we've got over there.
I'm assuming that will have been prior with Phil, so that was almost a decade ago.
Yeah, I guess so. I can't remember if on the Not Dead Yet tour, if we made it into the UK at all, because that was 2 years we were on the road with that. I don't know. Yeah, the brain does mysterious things.
Yeah, I was talking to Danny an hour or so back, and he was explaining because of your diaries and whatever, it's trying to fit the immediate family into the various projects all you guys have got on because you are, it's a bit of a cliche, masters at your craft, so you are in demand.
To me, it's always surprising when I anticipated getting to this age that you would be, because you always look at the music business as a flavor of the moment. Yet you thought you'd be a little bit more leisure time or leisure time, however we want to put it. And it's really surprising to me how insanely busy things are. And I would never complain, and I am totally appreciative of it, but it is surprising. So it's difficult for us with the immediate family. The weird part about the immediate family is if you look at each of us individually, it's incredible amount of work that we've done. But when you look at the band itself, it's like a new band.
Yeah.
And so trying to line up work and stuff, and a lot of people go when they're trying to book gigs and stuff, they go, "Oh, who are those? We never heard of that." And so we end up taking work, actual work, because the immediate family doesn't make any money
Yeah.
at this point because it's a newbie. So when Lyle Lovett calls or Stevie Nicks or anybody calls or sessions come up, that's our priority because that's still our bread and butter. And so, I hope more things can happen with us because I love the guys. Our history together is profound, to say the least. And the music is great. And every time we do a gig, people walk away going, "Oh, that was just fantastic. We love it. God, I had no idea you played it." And then it starts that whole ball rolling. So, we'll see what happens with it, but certainly it's by no means dead in the water. And we're still doing screenings of the documentary. And I try. There may be one in London, I think, while Russ and I are there. So, if at all possible, it might be on a day off so that we can go and do a Q&A with the audience and everything.
Yeah, I was watching some of the live footage. It's a song of yours, immediate family's House Will Fall, and you can,
Yeah.
there's just that natural connection that you guys have all got from playing with each other for 50 years. You're in just a groove together. It's just natural.
It's amazing. When we started this project, which really was all predicated on Danny being offered a record deal from Japan. And as soon as we started playing, we all looked at each other because Russ and I have been touring for years together, and I still do sessions with Waddy and Steve. Cooch, he didn't distance himself, but he realized that the thing he really loved was writing and producing. And then now he's moved away too. He's living in Rhode Island. But the rest of us, we see each other all the time, but we hadn't really been doing anything collectively. And suddenly, when you're sitting there playing and you're looking at each other going, wow, I forgot how easy this is. It's really so organic at this point for us.
Yeah, and you released an album this year, it's 2024, Skin in the Game, and there's even a version of a song originally by Sparks, the toughest
Yeah.
girl in town. But you've been able to make that your own despite it originally having a different feel.
That to me, it's if you're going to do covers of songs, make it something unique. Otherwise, go listen to the original. And for me, that's always the weird thing is when you hear almost like karaoke versions of so many things, and you go, "Oh, if I'm going to see that, hear that, I'd really rather listen to the original." But if suddenly you're listening to something, you're going, "God, that's cool," and you don't even realize that's what the song is, and suddenly you, "Oh God, that's," to me, that's when it's exciting, and that's really a really good song can be that. You can take it and make it your own, and the song still stands. And that was a good one. That really came from Waddy. That was he was going through like a Sparks little kind of foraging, and came on that, and he just thought this would be perfect for the band.
And the immediate family documentaries, certainly through the director, is almost a sequel in a way to the Wrecking Crew documentary that he worked on. But obviously, by the 1970s, the nature of working on sessions was different because you guys were much more visible and would have a stronger connection with certain artists.
Well, it's funny. I was with Denny last night. We did a show last night in town here that he was producing and directing. And so he asked me to come down and be involved in it. I was Santa Claus last night. But yeah, I was such a fan. Number one, I was a fan of the Wrecking Crew, period. I was in a band in 1967 called Group Therapy. And we weren't allowed to play on our record. We were too young and inexperienced. And when I walked into the studio, there was the Wrecking Crew doing our record. And 3 years later, I was working with those people every day. And they were mentors, they were friends. And, I spent so much time with Larry Knechtel and Hal Blaine and Mike Melvoin and, all those people. And when Denny did the movie, I went to a lot of the screenings for it. And because I was a transitory player in the scene where I came in at the very tail end of them. But the thing that was interesting was when we started, it was a really kind of a quantum shift in how the recordings were being done. We had a much deeper footprint on the records with the artists, where when the Wrecking Crew would walk in the studio, even though each of them brought their own thing to the table. I mean, Carol Kay would hear
Yeah.
some kind of a bass line and then she would go, well, how about this? And then made the song happen. They were remarkable, incredible musicians. So everything was laid out for them. We would go in and like with James Taylor, he would just sit down and play his guitar and we would have to come up with ideas. So our commitment was really on a different level. And it wasn't that kind of by the clock period of like we're working 10 to 1 and 2 to 5 and they would book us for a week and we would just be living in the studio. And sometimes we would start a project and by the end of the week we'd go back and start revisiting the first songs we cut because a thing had developed over a couple of days. And sometimes you were right initially on it, but other times things you went back to it and you went, ooh, this is good. So it was a different world, and it was really, I mean, touching the way Denny took what he learned with the Wrecking Crew and then was able to do this continuum in its own way, but because it was a different scene. And I remember talking to him one day, and he said, "Look, at the Wrecking Crew's life was about 10 years, where they really were the cats that did this." He said, "You guys are still working every day, and you've been at it almost 55 years, and there's no end in sight. I've got half next year booked already." So it's a different playing field. And it's so, I mean, if you were doing a documentary now about the business, it would be so profoundly different than what we experienced in what I really look at as like the golden age of recording the way it was done at that point. We were doing a slight continuum from the Wrecking Crew, that 60s form of working. But as our thing went on, then all of a sudden the formats were changing from to cassettes and CDs and then digital downloads and going from analog to digital recording and all that. So we've been kind of like gone from horse and buggy to NASCAR. It's it's been an amazing run, and I still sort of pinch myself every day thinking about how fortunate. I don't think I've never felt lucky. I've felt fortunate because we've worked incredibly hard at our craft, so that there was no luck involved. But the fortunate part was certain times, certain things happened that lined up where for other guys who were equally as good a musicians, that opportunity never came and they never got the break and they went on to do other things in their lives.
It seems so quick that where you're playing in groups, whether it's group therapy, and I think you were in quite a few groups in the late 60s, to
Yeah.
playing with James Taylor. And then obviously James took off huge. So immediately, you guys, Russ, Danny, things just took off.
It was an amazing period. And had it not been James, I don't know whether this would have ever happened. Even the whole musical journey that everybody from this area went on. James was like the perfect catalyst for this. He had the look, he had the songs, he had everything about it. And I was in a band called Wolfgang in the late 60s. And our drummers actually, we had two guys from England in the band, Bryn Howarth, who still works all the time. And
Oh, yeah, he's brilliant. Great
he's
guitarist.
oh, he's great, great. And he went on more of a spiritual thing, and
Yeah,
after and he
yeah,
like a Christian artist
yeah.
for decades over in England. And I just worked on a song for him. I mean, we haven't played together in almost 60
He's
years
doing
or
some great material at the minute.
yeah, he's wonderful. And our drummer, his name was Bugs Pemberton, and he was in Jackie Lomax and the Undertakers back in the
Right. So you got the Apple connection, the Beatles.
yeah. Bugs had a dear, so the two of them came to America, and we ended up hooking up and forming this band Wolfgang with Kevin Kelly and Randy Zacuto. And yeah, it was still one of the best bands I was ever in. We called ourselves Wolfgang because Bill Graham was our manager, and Bill Graham's real name was Wolfgang.
Oh,
We thought, what better thing to do to suck up to your manager than name your band after him? But and the first gig we ever played, we had never been on stage before. The very first gig we ever played was opening for Led Zeppelin at Winterland in San Francisco. But Bugs, the drummer, had a friend named John Fishback who owned Crystal Recording Studios here in Hollywood. And he had produced and engineered like all the early Stevie Wonder records. And so and he had a friend who had just gotten back from England that we had a house that the band had, and he would come and hang at our rehearsals. And this friend of his had just gotten back from England, and he brought him to one of the rehearsals just to hang out with us. And that was James Taylor. And James played us some of his songs, and we hung out for a couple of days. And that was it. And then his Apple album tanked. It really wasn't successful, but his James Taylor album, which they had just recorded when I met him, they were getting ready to promote it. And Peter Asher, who was managing and producing James at that point, had a band for the Troubadour. The first gig they were going to play was the Troubadour. And the band was Cooch and Russ and Carole King on piano. And they needed a bass player. And after that rehearsal, James called Peter and he said, I found my bass player. They called me and tracked me down and they asked, would you play this show? And I said, oh, are you kidding? I'd love to do this. I was still in college at that point, and we did the show. And then right after that, he got offered a tour, like a month-long tour. And I had never really gone on the road before. I'd gigged mostly in Los Angeles in clubs. And they said, you want to do it? And I kind of looked at my schedule with final exams and everything. And I went, yeah, let's do it. And I walked out of college and after 5 years and never looked back. And then next thing, James was on the cover of Time magazine. And all of a sudden, I went from literally having only recorded demos with Wolfgang to being a first call player in town, not knowing how to get a sound, how to really do. I had no studio experience. Like most of us really were neophytes at the studio, but because of the James connection, which if John hadn't brought him to our rehearsal, I would, I mean, these things that are floating and something comes together. And that's why, to me, that's where the fortunate part of this comes. Then the other fortunate part of that equation would be that the opportunity came and I had the skills that they needed. Because if I hadn't been playing the way he wanted to, what he liked, he would never have mentioned. They would have looked for somebody else. So there's so many things that happened, but it went from like 0 to 100 overnight. It's not because I have people, I do clinics and master classes, and people ask, man, I want to do what you did. How can I do that? And I kind of look at them, I go, I honestly have no idea what to tell you because I didn't go into it with any intention. I didn't have a game plan. It's just fortunate that whatever I was doing stylistically and the way I thought about parts fit that period perfectly. And it was such a vibrant time here in Los Angeles. There were so many artists coming out at that point. The record labels were like on fire. And so they were signing everybody, and they would look at probably the pivotal thing for all of us was, and Cooch may have mentioned it too, was the fact that Peter chose to put our names on the album jacket.
Mm.
And the Wrecking Crew never got credit on. So when people were listening to the Mamas and the Papas and the Beach Boys and Frank Sinatra and all, they had no idea it was the same musicians playing on everything. So for us, the fact that Peter put our name on James's record, then when the labels and producers were signing artists, they kind of the benchmark album for them was James. And they would look at it and say, Lee and Russ and Cooch. And well, my God, if it works for James, let's try to get those guys. And the next thing we were working our asses off. And then the only other really fortunate thing for me was I came from the world of I was a classical pianist as a child. So my reading skills were really strong. So when our names started getting bantered around in the studio situation, then I was getting calls for television and movies and commercials and all that because they were all reading dates.
It's interesting you talk about the opportunity because one of the things that would have been a challenge for or an opportunity for a bass player playing with James Taylor is his guitar work. You just like songs like Mexico. Do you follow his guitar work or do you do something different? It's a
Both.
yeah.
Both. Yeah, I mean, that was really, to me, I'm glad you noted that because it was, James was a challenge where like so many guitar players are just flat picking along or just strumming their chords, where James has such a comprehensive guitar technique that so many other musicians I've worked with, they always go, man, James's guitar playing, that's, from Clint Black to Garth Brooks, every time I'd be around those guys, they'd want to play James Taylor songs because they wanted to work on their guitar playing. He always had bass lines going. He was really so comprehensive rhythmically, bass lines, chordally. So when I started playing with him, I kind of was going, well, what the hell am I here for? What am I going to do? So I really had to listen to him, and I would pick things that I thought was really good that we did together. And then I would look for a counterpuntal things that I could do around his guitar playing because I didn't want him to have to accommodate me. It was my job to work with him. So I would really listen to him. And it didn't take long before we developed a kind of a simpatico, or when we would sit down to play, things would just start to fall into place because it had become so organic for us. But in the beginning, it was a challenge, especially Wolfgang was like a serious hard rock band, and all of a sudden I'm doing sensitive folkish music that I had never really played. I was a rock guy. I was totally into Zeppelin and Cream and 10 Years After and all the bands that were coming out of England and the Bay Area. So it was a challenge to suddenly wrap my head around this totally unique way of approaching things. But it was LA was so fertile, like I was saying, with artists and music and the hang. The thing that was interesting then was it was a real community where a lot of times I think music got to the point where people were being possessive about their music, where then we'd be in the studio with James doing a track like Mexico, and David Crosby and Graham Nash would stop by the studio and he'd go, you wanted to sing background, and it was just this community vibe, Joni would show up or Jackson or all these people. There was such a sense of sharing amongst everybody. I'm sure it still exists, but the situation is so profoundly different than it was then. Most of half the work I do right now, I'm just sitting where I am right now,
Yeah.
talking to you, just doing bass parts for people. And granted, I'm grateful to be working, but it is certainly not the way I would like to be doing it because the interaction and
Yeah.
interrelationships in a studio full of musicians, to me is where the true magic happens. All I can do when I'm sitting here is do a bass part, but I can't make suggestions. I can't. What was that you just played? Let me hear that again. And so it's a it's a different world, but kind of one of my mantras is don't become an old fart. I don't want to be around guys that are going back in my day, kind of sound like grandpa. To me, I'm thrilled to be working every day. I will never whine about that stuff. It's just different.
One of the great things as well is that the different styles of music you played on, even relatively early on in terms of your session work. Because just a few days ago, he lives quite near me, I was with Ken Scott, who
Oh,
worked
great.
on, yeah,
Spectrum.
Billy. You both worked on Billy Cobham's album Spectrum, and
Yeah.
one of the key tracks, certainly now, because the track's been taken on, which is leads with your bass line, is Stratus.
Yeah.
Um, was it a challenge working on? That's quite different to James Taylor.
Oh God, yeah. It's funny. Since I've been doing a YouTube channel, I have to go back and visit things, and I look at that very same little period of 1973, and I'm looking at all the different projects. And I go, "This is so schizoid." I mean, it's like they have no relationship. But I got to know Billy because our group, The Section, which evolved out of James Taylor's band with Danny and Russ and myself. And then when Carol left because she cut Tapestry, and you really can't have a side person in your band who has the biggest record in the world at that point. And then I met Craig Durgy on a project and suggested him, and he came in. So we ended up forming that band. And one of the gigs we did was opening for Mahavishnu Orchestra for about a month, and we all became friends at that point. And right after that, Billy called me and he said, "Look, I got an opportunity to go in the studio. Would you like to come to New York and work on my album?" And basically, we did that whole album in 2 days. It's pretty much one or two takes of each thing. Now, the thing that to me that was interesting is when I walked into the studio, there was Tommy Bolin to play guitar. Well, I knew Tommy from Zephyr because we were handled by the same manager when I was in Wolfgang, so we did gigs together. And I went, "Man, what are you doing here?" And he goes, "Oh, Billy called me for this." But I had gotten to know Billy and Jan from being on the road with them. We went in, and then I met Ken Scott for the first time there, who I had ultimate admiration for as an engineer. And it was just, one of those things where you just go in, and our chops were up because the section was pretty intense playing too. So it wasn't like sitting there kind of figuring what I'm going to play around James's thumb. We were playing pretty intense music. So the chops were there. It was just people didn't necessarily think of me in that environment, because I get people that still come up to me and they go, "Oh man, Spectrum's one of my favorite records." And I go, "Yeah, it was one of my favorite things to work on." And they went, "You played on that?" I mean, never even looked at the credits. But to me, that it's really remarkable that was cut in 1973. And if you listen to it right now,
Yeah.
it stood the test of time. I mean, it is still a powerful piece of music. And there were great things that happened in that stuff. Robert Moog came to the sessions, and
Really?
when you hear like there's some inner things between tracks where you hear drums sequencing going, that was electronic drums that Moog had brought to the session for Billy to try out. It was just one of those things that was like raw energy in there. It was so much fun. And then you have things like Massive Attack, then sampling Stratus,
Yeah.
and people are going, "Oh man, man, that Massive Attack." I said, "Do you know where it came from?" And they go, "What? What are you talking?" And then I say, "Check this out." And they go, "Really? Oh my God." But I'm real proud of that. That's one of the albums I cite as one of my favorite projects that I ever got to work on. And it became this quintessential footprint during that jazz rock fusion period of Chick Corea and Mahavishnu and Stanley Clarke and all the people in that period of music. That really is one of the ones that so many people cite as one of their favorite albums. Real proud of that.
I was listening to the title track of Gene Clark's No Other and just admiring that bass line. Is that your bass line or is it a synthesizer?
I have 5 basses. Almost the entire track is bass. They gave me free reign to come up with distortion bass, octave bass, doing melodic things and doing subharmonic. So I think there's 4 or 5 basses on it. Almost the entire track is all bass parts. I love Gene, man. Gene was so great to work with. And that is really one of those cult albums that never got the due that it deserved. Uh, but the people that are into it are deeply into it, kind of the same way when we did Children of the Sun with Billy Thorpe.
Yeah.
There's this whole cult following of that. They're going, oh man, it's all through high school. That's all we listen to. We'd get stoned and listen to that with headphones and stuff. So it's cool. But yeah, Gene was wonderful on that. I think Russ played on that too. I'd have to go back and look at the credits on that one, but
I think it's quite varied, isn't it? There was quite a few
yeah,
players.
there's a bunch of different players involved on that.
You date quite a while back with Jackson Brown as well, don't you?
Yeah, we did Jackson's. Well, we did his first album, certainly with Doctor My Eyes and all those songs, that very first album that looked like a water bag that you would hang on your bumper. And then we did, I think, on The Pretender and For Every Man. I worked with him up through Running on Empty. And I think Running on Empty was the only actual real touring I did with Jackson. Then after that, because Bob Glaub has worked with him for years on bass, and we shared bass duties on some of those the earlier albums. I know I did the whole first album, but I think Bob and I shared some tracks on the subsequent albums. But I loved working with Jackson. He's another one of those guys that just his writing is so beautiful, and his musicianship is great, and his heart is great. He's a really gifted human being, and it's really a pleasure to always get a chance to do anything with him.
One of my favorite podcast guests who I've spoken to is Sean Phillips. And
God,
uh, we were talking to him about the album Transcendence and Motes of Dust, that track. And he told me that you are the most lyrical bass player in the world. Obviously, very complimentary. Do you remember working on that?
oh, I love Sean is great. Sean is just wonderful. I mean, there's nobody that sounds like him or writes like him. And his guitar playing is so strong, and he's just like a good old Texas boy. And we stayed in touch. I just remember one of my deepest memories was when he had moved to Italy, and he was out in a little boat, and he had like waist length hair, and it got caught in the motor and tore his scalp off. And we were so afraid he was going to die. But he's one of those guys that every time we'd go in the studio to work on projects, it was always an adventure because it was going to be unlike any other artist who I would get called to work with. And you'd have to hunker down. Peter Robinson, who played keyboards on that stuff, was the keyboard player in Brand X and on Phil Collins's first No Jacket Required album and tour. And we've maintained a friendship over all the years. He became a film score writer, but every time we would go in the studio with Sean, it was like, this is going to be cool. It's not pedestrian.
You're also known as working with Giorgio Moroder and David Bowie on Cat People. So again, that's a different challenge for you.
Everything's a challenge. And that's the thing that people say to me. They go, how do you keep your interest level up after this many years? I go, because every day is different. I'm not in a band that has like a set and then they go out on the road every year and maybe they've done like 8 albums and they can go out and gig those things. I've worked on thousands of songs, and each time I get called to go to work, I'm joining a new band or it's a new project. To go in the studio, I had done a bunch of stuff. I had done some Donna Summer stuff with Giorgio and some Village People, and I loved that whole period of the disco period. Every time I'd walk in and see a chart that was all octaves, I'd go, I know what we're doing today, kind of a thing. And I was a huge Bowie fan. I just, so, he wasn't there when we cut the album. I just was in the studio uh, with Keith Forsey, who had played drums on the stuff, and Giorgio. We were just working on parts, but it was fun when it was done to hear it all finished up and how it fit in the movie and all that. But I've done a lot of films, and it's always fascinating when you have to go in, especially if it's a massive reading date where you're not really bringing you to the table, you're bringing your ability to the table, and you're reading parts that are almost damn impossible, to play. And so it's a new challenge, and there's a new challenge every day. And I always also look at it as each thing, it's unto itself. Like I would have people once in a while, like if I was doing a clinic and they'd say, doing some of those country dates, aren't they boring? And I go, no, No, I said, if I'm working on a song and all it wants is whole notes, I'm good with that. I'm just going to make them the best whole note I can make them. I don't have to be, I'm not there to show off me. I'm there to listen to the song and the artist and do what I think is the most supportive thing I can do. And every once, I always look in a song if there's like even one bar where I can throw in just a little something just to put my footprint on there. I'm happy with that. So, it's I go through different things every day when I go in the studio. It can be from the most intense, like a metal date, down to like a commercial for a rental car, and you do the same work for both of those. There's no difference to me. You're making music.
Yeah, that reminds me of there's a drummer called Clem Catini over here in the UK, and very much a similar approach. I came to the realization a couple of days ago that you playing Sussudio live for Phil Collins, you were having to emulate what someone was doing on a synth.
David Frank, I believe, did that. And when he finished the track, I remember looking at Phil going, well, we're screwed now. How are we going to do this live? And we ended up, I mean, I learned the bass part that he had created, but sonically it wasn't going to be, it's a big difference between having 4 or 5 synths all midied together and a Fender bass. So what we ended up doing live with that was we resampled the envelope filter that was used on the records, all the stuff that went pow, 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 pow. And then I played the sonic note for all that. And we doubled the whole part that way. And then as years went on, we got less and less of that, and the bass took over at that point. But it was a challenge because that's a pretty intense part that is a very synth part. And there was no real anything on the Sussudio track on the original recording. But one of the things Phil really always took pride in, and especially as years went on and this business changed, there are so many acts on the road right now that are barely playing anything live. Everything is all canned music that they're miming. And Phil really insisted that his shows be live. And so we were taking these things that had machine tracks and eliminating nobody was playing to click tracks or any of that stuff. It was every night would be a little bit different. And the funny thing with the studio, as I recall, though, is Phil's one of those guys that when we were in the studio, he would start just scatting, like coming up with ideas because he didn't finish his. And when he did Sussudio, I think he intended to replace the word Sussudio and then never found anything that worked as well. But I think he was just going, oh, studio, adding something so that there would be stuff to record to. And then when it was all done, he went, I don't know what else to do. Because of so many of the songs I did with him early on, they didn't have, they just hit him humming a melody. And then when I heard it for the first time, it was after I had already done bass parts where he had done his lyrics and vocals. So
That's one of the great things about the Immediate Family documentary is that you get to see the connections and the admiration that the artists that you worked with. It was a real collaborative effort that you guys, all of you guys, did.
yeah, I thought it was really when I saw when we all sat down and watched the movie for the first time, I thought it was really touching how genuine all the artists were that when the James would talk about he couldn't understate the impact and what we brought to his music and all that, because so many times you work with artists and they go, oh, couldn't have done it without you, and then you never hear from them again. They never mention you when they're getting their awards and all that. But it was really touching in the movie how genuine Henley and Carol and Linda and everybody was, because it really felt like when Cooch came up with the name Immediate Family, because the record for Japan was going to be Danny Korchmar, and he just said, I'm just going to call this the Immediate Family because this is my immediate family. And because there's always been that feeling amongst all of us that this really, it's like, in some ways, the family you wish you had. Everybody's really been there for each other. And I'm so appreciative of all the things we've been able to do together over all the years. And I'll be with Russ in England and with Lyle this year. So he and I still see each other all the time and work all the time together. So there's something pretty amazing when you're on stage and you look next to you and you're looking at a guy who you've been looking at for going on 55 years. And that's pretty rare in this world. 5 years is a miracle for a lot of people. So it's something really special for us.
Yeah, it comes across in the music and the latest immediate family album, Skin in the Game, and it
Yeah.
absolutely does come across in the documentary, which I know it's won many awards, but if any of the viewers or listeners haven't seen it, I do highly recommend everyone seeking it out too. So thank you so
It's
much for your time, Lee.
Oh, thank you, man. It's an absolute pleasure to see you, and anytime I'm always here for you. At
All
Katz's Deli.
right, to Yorkshire. Take care.
Okay, you too. All the best.